I am Julian. I am 32 years old. And 3 years ago, I sat in a mahogany-paneled office and watched my own flesh and blood try to erase me from existence. While my grandfather was taking his final breaths in a sterile hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped the rhythm of his fading life, my parents were busy making sure I would never get the chance to say a final goodbye. They smiled at me with absolute venom in their eyes across a massive oak conference table. My older brother, Adrian, the undeniable golden child of our toxic family tree, was practically vibrating with greed. My mother, Beatrice, looked at me with that familiar expression of total disgust, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace before she delivered the line she had undoubtedly been practicing in the mirror for years. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the $10 million inheritance check sitting right in front of my brother, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to go earn my own. They laughed. They actually laughed at me in front of a high-powered corporate lawyer and half a dozen legal assistants who pretended not to hear the cruelty echoing off the walls. But there was one thing they did not know. They had absolutely no idea that my grandfather had planned for their betrayal. They had no idea what was inside the worn, sealed envelope that Mr. Sterling, the estate lawyer, was about to pull out of his thick leather briefcase. And let me tell you, right now, as I sit here speaking to you, my brother is completely bankrupt. His luxury cars have been repossessed, and my parents are begging me to answer their phone calls. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little lives and took back my dignity, hit that like button if you believe that karma always comes to collect its debts. And do me a favor, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. It helps me know that I am not alone in this journey. Now let's go back to where this nightmare truly began. The air in Mr. Sterling's downtown office was suffocating. It smelled of expensive cedarwood cologne, old parchment paper, and pure, unfiltered greed. The massive grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked like a heavy metronome, counting down the agonizing seconds to what my family fully believed would be my ultimate, inescapable humiliation. I sat at the far, isolated end of the long table, keeping my posture perfectly straight, refusing to let my shoulders slump. I wore a simple, off-the-rack gray suit. It was clean, it was pressed, but it was nothing flashy. It was the suit I wore to entry-level job interviews, the suit I wore when I needed to feel like a respectable adult. Across from me sat Adrian. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than my entire annual salary at the engineering firm. He spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting checking his solid gold Rolex every 30 seconds, sighing loudly to let everyone in the room know that his time was vastly more important than ours. My father, Arthur, sat right next to him, his chest puffed out like a proud, victorious rooster. For my entire life, the dynamic in our household was crystal clear. It was never a secret. Adrian was the investment and I was the liability. When Adrian wanted to start a flashy tech company that produced absolutely nothing of tangible value, my parents happily liquidated a massive portion of their retirement portfolios and handed him the cash without blinking an eye. When I asked for just a tiny fraction of my own college fund to buy essential lab equipment for an advanced mechanical engineering project I was working on, my father laughed in my face. He told me I was wasting my life on foolish hobbies and needed to get a real job stocking shelves at Walmart to finally learn the true value of $1. That was the harsh reality I grew up in. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner years ago. Our house was full of extended family, neighbors, and my parents' wealthy friends from their HOA meetings. My aunt had just gone through a brutal divorce, and the table conversation was tense, filled with legal jargon about custody battles and asset division. My mother, desperate to change the subject and shine the spotlight back on her perfect life, raised her crystal wine glass. She spent 45 uninterrupted minutes boasting about Adrian's latest promotion, his expanding real estate portfolio, and his brilliant connections. When my uncle politely turned to me and asked how my senior science thesis was going, my mother waved her hand dismissively, rolling her eyes. Oh, Julian is still doing his little dirt and wire things. Bless his heart, he just doesn't have the head for the real world. The whole table chuckled. I sat there, staring at my plate, chewing on food that suddenly tasted like ash. That was who they were. That was who they had always been. Back in the lawyer's office, Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. He was a man of very few words, with sharp eyes like a hawk and a demeanor so cold it could freeze boiling water. He slid the massive watermark check across the polished wood. The zeros on that piece of paper seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. $10 million. The absolute bulk of my grandfather's liquid assets. Adrian snatched the check so incredibly fast I honestly thought he was going to tear the paper in half. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face like a poison. My mother patted his shoulder affectionately, leaning in to whisper something in his ear that made him chuckle. Then, she slowly turned her head to look down the table at me. Her eyes traveled up and down my cheap gray suit, resting momentarily on my scuffed dress shoes. She leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the table. "Julian," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sympathy she always used when she wanted to cut me deepest. "Do not look so utterly disappointed. Your brother has a real business to run. He has hundreds of employees, a massive payroll, a sterling reputation in the industry to uphold. You tinker with dirt and wires in a dusty shed. We decided it was best for the family legacy that the inheritance goes to someone who can actually multiply it. Go earn your own. Maybe this will finally motivate you to grow up and face reality." My father nodded in stern agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. "It is just business, Julian. No hard feelings. You have to understand how the real world operates." I did not flinch. I did not yell. I gripped the armrests of my leather chair until my knuckles turned completely white, but I kept my face as blank and unreadable as a stone wall. I looked right into my mother's cold eyes and gave her a very small, very detached smile. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Then, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. It was palpable, like the drop in barometric pressure right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. Mr. Sterling did not close his thick manila folder. He did not offer his professional congratulations to Adrian. Instead, he reached deep into the inner pocket of his briefcase and pulled out a heavy, yellowed envelope. The edges were frayed and soft from age. Across the front, in thick, unmistakable black ink, was my grandfather's bold handwriting. My mother's condescending smile vanished instantly. My father's arms uncrossed, dropping heavily to his sides. Adrian completely stopped staring at his $10 million check. "I believe we are jumping the gun here," Mr. Sterling said, his deep voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "The $10 million is only one clause of Walter Whitman's estate. There is a final, sealed document, and its execution takes absolute precedence over all financial distributions." That envelope changed everything. It was the spark that ignited the explosion of my family's carefully constructed empire of lies, deceit, and manipulation. But the truth is, the groundwork for that explosive moment in the lawyer's office had been laid days earlier, in a place I had not seen in over a grueling, heartbreaking year. A place where the comforting scent of motor oil and sawdust used to mean safety, but now only smelled like profound betrayal. I had to walk through the fire to get to that conference room. And the fire started with my grandmother. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. 3 days before that fateful, world-shattering will reading, I drove my heavily dented, 15-year-old pickup truck down a long, winding dirt road on the extreme outskirts of Charleston. The gravel crunched loudly and rhythmically under my worn tires. The ancient oak trees, draped heavily in gray Spanish moss, cast long, twisting shadows over the faded hood of my car. At the very end of the road stood my grandfather's old workshop and research lab. It was a massive, sprawling converted barn with a rusted tin roof and wide double doors that looked like they belonged on a medieval fortress. When I was a kid, this place was my absolute sanctuary. While my parents were busy dragging Adrian to elite country clubs and private golf lessons, Grandpa Walter would sneak me out here. We would spend entire weekends covered in grease, building rudimentary solar panels, taking apart old radios, and talking about how the world worked. He was the only person on this earth who looked at me and saw potential instead of disappointment. But as I pulled up that afternoon, the sight of the property made my stomach twist into painful knots. The paint on the main house was peeling off in large, sad strips. The garden, once meticulously kept by my grandmother, was severely overgrown, choked by aggressive weeds and thorny vines. I had not been back to this property in 14 agonizing months. Not since the beautiful, crisp spring before my grandfather passed away. My family made sure of that. Every single time I tried to call the house, every time I planned a weekend trip to visit, I was met with an impenetrable brick wall of excuses and lies. My mother would answer the phone, her voice hushed, and tell me Grandpa was resting, that his heart was too weak for visitors. Adrian would send me aggressive text messages late at night, telling me I was stressing the old man out and needed to stay away if I actually cared about his survival. I was trying to build my own life, working 80-hour weeks at a demanding engineering firm just to pay off my student loans. Loans I only had because my parents gave my college fund to Adrian for a down payment on a luxury condo. I was exhausted and I foolishly believed them. I believed they were genuinely protecting his fragile health. When my grandfather finally died, I did not even know until 3 days later. They didn't call me. They didn't send a family friend. They sent me an email. A standard, cold, 2-sentence email from my father's assistant, telling me the funeral had already taken place. I parked my truck near the dying magnolia tree and killed the engine. The silence around the property was completely deafening. I stepped out, my heavy work boots sinking slightly into the dry, unforgiving earth. I walked slowly up the creaky wooden steps to the main house adjacent to the workshop. I hesitated for a long moment before knocking. My chest felt dangerously tight. I was grieving a man I never got the chance to say goodbye to, and I was about to face the woman I thought had willingly abandoned me to the wolves. The heavy wooden door swung open before I could even lower my fist. Standing there in the doorway was my grandmother, Eleanor. She was 80 years old, but she stood as perfectly straight as a decorated soldier. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe, tight bun. She wore a simple, high-collared black dress, the universal color of deep mourning, but her eyes were anything but sorrowful. They were ablaze with absolute, unadulterated fury. "So," she said, her voice slicing through the thick, humid southern air like a freshly sharpened razor blade, "you finally decided to show up." I froze completely. "Grandma," I started, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. "Do not," she snapped viciously, stepping back as if my physical touch would burn her skin. "Do not pretend you care, Julian. Not now. Not when the ground is already settled over his grave." Her words hit me like a physical, heavy blow to the ribs. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking uncontrollably despite my absolute best efforts to keep it steady. I tried to come. I tried to call. Mom and Dad said he was way too sick for visitors. They said the funeral was private. I drove here the second I read the email. Eleanor let out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh that echoed off the porch ceiling. "Private? The entire town was there, Julian. Everyone from his old engineering firm. The neighbors. The people from his charity board. Everyone except his own flesh and blood grandson. They told me you were too busy. They told me you had a big corporate promotion coming up and you did not want to be bothered with a dying old man. You had a shiny new life, they said. You were too important for us now." My stomach dropped so fast it felt like I was falling out of an airplane. No, Grandma, that is a lie. I would have dropped everything. I would have quit my job on the spot. I did not know. They shut me out." She crossed her frail arms, her jaw set incredibly tight. "Your grandfather called for you, Julian, every single day, for 3 agonizing weeks. He sat in that worn armchair right there in the living room, hooked up to a loud oxygen tank, struggling to breathe, and he dialed your number until his arthritic fingers went completely numb. He cried for you. You never answered. Not once." My blood turned to absolute ice. "Grandma, I have had the exact same cell phone number since my freshman year of college. I never got a single missed call from him. I never got a voicemail. Nothing. I swear to you. She stared at me hard, her sharp eyes searching my face, desperately looking for a lie, for a crack in my story. Slowly, the intense fury in her eyes began to flicker, replaced by a terrible, creeping, sickening doubt. She turned around without another word, walking stiffly into the dim living room. I followed her inside. The house smelled like stale lavender, old leather-bound books, and profound sadness. She walked over to the small side table, opened the drawer, and pulled out a worn leather notepad. It was Grandpa's, the one he always kept tucked in his front shirt pocket. She opened it to a heavily marked page and shoved it forcefully into my hands. This is the number he was calling, the one Arthur gave us. Your father explicitly said you changed your number to avoid annoying work calls on the weekends. I looked down at the fragile, yellowed paper. The handwriting was incredibly shaky, a devastating testament to his failing health in those final days. But the numbers were clear. I stared at the 10 digits written in blue ink. My heart pounded so hard and so fast I could hear it echoing in my ears. Grandma, I whispered, looking slowly up at her face. This is not my number. It is not even close. The silence in the room became heavier than gravity itself. Eleanor stared at the notepad, then back up at me. Her pale, thin hands began to tremble violently. They told us you changed it, she said, her voice breaking, barely a whisper now. They told us you were deeply ashamed of this place, ashamed of him, ashamed of me. They lied to you, I said, backing slowly toward the wall because my knees genuinely felt like they were going to give out under my weight. They lied to both of you. They cut me off from you on purpose. They gave you a fake number so he would die thinking I did not care. They wanted to erase me. Eleanor sank slowly into the old floral armchair beside the cold fireplace. All the fight, all the rigid anger drained out of her in an instant. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. I rushed over, knelt right beside her chair, and took her cold, incredibly fragile hands in mine. They sent me a generic email about the funeral, I told her, tears finally blurring my vision, my voice cracking. I drove down the minute I read it. The church was completely empty. The groundskeeper told me the service had been at 9 in the morning. The email my father's assistant sent said it was at noon. They made absolutely sure I missed it, Grandma. A single, heavy tear rolled down Eleanor's deeply wrinkled cheek. She squeezed my hands with a sudden strength that genuinely surprised me. We know the truth now, she said softly, her voice gaining a dangerous edge. That is what matters. We know. We sat there together in the quiet, dusty house for a long time. The antique grandfather clock on the mantel ticked loudly, echoing the broken heartbeat of the home. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window panes. I was entirely consumed by a grief so profound it felt like I was drowning in an ocean of tar. My own parents, my own brother, they had meticulously orchestrated a psychological execution. They wanted me isolated, and they wanted my grandfather to die with a broken heart, believing I had abandoned him for a corporate paycheck. Suddenly, Eleanor let go of my hands. She stood up. Her back was perfectly straight again, but the deep sorrow in her eyes was entirely gone. It was replaced by something much, much more dangerous. It was cold, calculated, terrifying wrath. I am calling them, she said, walking with intense purpose toward the kitchen. Who? I asked, standing up, wiping my face. She picked up the heavy plastic receiver of the old rotary phone mounted on the floral wallpaper. My son, his wicked, venomous wife, and your arrogant brother. She dialed the numbers with sharp, aggressive, deliberate motions. When the line connected, she did not say hello. Arthur, it is your mother. I need you, Beatrice, Adrian, and Thomas here at the house. Now. I could hear my father's muffled, confused, and instantly annoyed voice buzzing through the receiver. He was probably making up a pathetic excuse about a golf game or an urgent real estate meeting. Eleanor cut him off brutally. No, it cannot wait. Mr. Sterling is on his way right now. We are reading Walter's final instructions regarding the workshop property. Be here in an hour, or I swear to God Almighty I will burn this entire estate to the ground before I let you see a single dime of inheritance." She slammed the phone back onto the receiver with a loud clatter. She turned to me, her eyes flashing with a terrifying brilliance. "The lawyer is actually coming. Your grandfather left specific, ironclad instructions that certain legal documents could only be opened inside the workshop, with everyone physically present. They thought they could handle it all in a sterile corporate office next week. They were wrong." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "They do not know I am here." "Good," Eleanor said, walking past me toward the front door, pulling it open. "Let them walk right into the trap blindly. Go wait in the workshop, Julian. Stay in the shadows until I call your name. It is time we show this arrogant family what happens when you corner a Whitman." I walked out the back door and headed toward the massive barn. The air was thick with the promise of a violent storm. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The workshop was massive, a sprawling cavern of rusted steel, forgotten projects, and the heavy, comforting scent of ozone and machine grease. Dust motes danced lazily in the thick streams of afternoon sunlight filtering through the high, severely unwashed windows. I walked slowly past rows of heavy wooden workbenches, my fingers trailing lightly over old, heavy wrenches, complex circuit boards, and a completely disassembled tractor engine that we never quite got around to fixing. This place was my grandfather's brilliant mind made physical. It was a temple of creation, and it was the only place on this earth I had ever felt truly seen, truly valued. I retreated to the far, dark corner of the lab, stepping behind a towering rack of industrial metal shelving. From here, I had a perfectly clear view of the main floor and the large, scarred wooden table in the center, but the deep shadows completely concealed me from anyone walking through the front doors. I leaned back against the cold metal, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had 45 minutes to kill before they arrived. 45 minutes trapped alone with the ghosts of my past. As I stood there in the quiet, the memories flooded back, incredibly bitter and sharp. I vividly remembered sitting at that exact wooden table when I was 16 years old, showing my father a complex robotics project I had spent 6 grueling months building for a state-level science competition. I had won first place. I was so incredibly proud my chest physically ached. Arthur had glanced at the gleaming trophy, scoffed loudly, and asked how much the raw parts had cost me. When I proudly told him, he shook his head in disgust. "What a complete waste of money," he had said, not even looking me in the eye. Adrian just landed a highly competitive summer internship at a major real estate firm in the city. That's how you build a future, Julian. Not playing with expensive toys in a dirty shed. I remembered the excruciating Thanksgiving dinners where Beatrice would spend hours boasting to anyone who would listen about Adrian's massive college fund, his brand new Porsche, his rapidly expanding social circle of wealthy elites. Whenever a distant relative or family friend politely asked about my life, she would wave her hand dismissively, letting out a heavy sigh. "Oh, Julian is still doing his little science things. Bless his heart, he just doesn't have the head for business or networking. We're just hoping he finds a steady salary somewhere so he isn't a burden." They had spent my entire life grinding my self-esteem down to fine dust, convincing the world, and almost successfully convincing me, that I was entirely defective. But Grandpa Walter never bought into their toxic narrative for a single second. He saw the exact way I looked at the world, the way I understood systems and mechanics. He secretly funded my projects. He paid for my expensive college textbooks when my parents flat out refused to give me a dime, telling me I needed to take out more loans to build character. He was my absolute anchor, and they stole my chance to hold his hand when he died. The loud crunch of luxury tires on gravel snapped me violently back to reality. A sleek, black Porsche Cayenne pulled up outside the barn, aggressively kicking up dust. The heavy double doors creaked open, letting in a blinding flood of harsh afternoon light. And there they were, the architects of my misery. My father walked in first, wearing a crisp, designer polo shirt and expensive tailored slacks, looking around the sacred space with sheer, undisguised disgust. "Good Lord, it smells like a literal junkyard in here," he complained loudly, waving a hand in front of his face. "I told Mom to hire a professional cleaning crew months ago. This place is an absolute dump." My mother followed closely behind him, covering her nose and mouth with a silk designer scarf. "It is a severe health hazard, Arthur. I do not understand for the life of me why Eleanor insisted we come all the way out here to this godforsaken shed. My Prada shoes are getting completely ruined in this filthy dirt." Then came Adrian, eyes glued to his latest smartphone, not even bothering to look up at the space where his grandfather had spent his entire life. "Let's just get this over with quickly," he whined, his voice nasal and irritated. "My investors are breathing down my neck. If we do not secure the IP patents from the estate today, my startup is going to tank by Friday, and the lawsuit from the tech conglomerate will bankrupt me. I don't have time for sentimental garbage." Behind them trailed Uncle Thomas. Thomas was Arthur's younger brother. He was the kind of man who smiled warmly to your face while sliding a jagged knife deep into your back. He was the one who managed the family's external communications and PR. The one who, I now knew with sickening certainty, had orchestrated the fake phone number scheme to isolate my grandfather. Eleanor walked in last, her face an unreadable mask of stone. She closed the heavy doors behind her with a loud thud, plunging the room back into dim, atmospheric light. She walked over to the large wooden table and stood firmly at the head of it. "Take a seat," she commanded, her voice brooking absolutely no argument. Arthur sighed dramatically, using a pristine white handkerchief to wipe dust off a wooden stool before sitting down. "Mom, this is ridiculous and unnecessary. We have a formal meeting scheduled with Sterling at his downtown office on Monday. Why the sudden theatrics? We already know the contents of the will. You get the house and your retirement fund, Adrian gets the massive cash injection for his tech firm, and Beatrice and I divide the commercial real estate. It is done. Let's just sign the preliminary papers and go." "It is not done until the final document is read in its entirety," Eleanor said coldly, not moving an inch. Adrian rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his expensive chest. "It's probably just some emotional, sentimental garbage. Who gets the old pocket watch, who gets the rusty tools, who gets the useless junk? Let's just sign the damn papers so I can leave and save my company." I gripped the sharp metal edge of the shelving unit so hard my hand ached. The absolute arrogance. The pure, unadulterated entitlement. They stood in the temple of a great man and treated it like a nuisance, an obstacle to their greed. Right on cue, a pristine silver Lexus pulled up outside. The side door opened again, and Mr. Sterling stepped into the barn. He carried his heavy leather briefcase tight against his side and looked completely out of place in the dusty industrial workshop. He nodded respectfully to Eleanor and approached the table, opening his briefcase with methodical, terrifying precision. "Good afternoon, everyone," Sterling said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. "As per Walter Whitman's explicit, legally binding instructions, the reading of the final addendum must take place on this physical property, with all surviving immediate family members present." Arthur frowned deeply, looking around the table. "All immediate family? We are all here. Let's get on with it." Sterling looked up, his sharp eyes scanning the dim room. "Not quite." Eleanor turned slowly toward the dark corner of the lab where I was hidden. Her voice rang out, clear, steady, and full of fierce pride. "Come out, Julian." I took a deep, shuddering breath. I pushed myself off the cold metal rack and stepped out of the shadows. The sound of my heavy work boots hitting the concrete floor echoed like gunshots in the suddenly silent room. I walked slowly, deliberately, into the light. I did not look at the floor. I did not slouch my shoulders. I kept my chin held high and locked eyes directly with my mother. The reaction was instantaneous and spectacularly chaotic. Beatrice gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest, dropping her thousands of dollars designer purse right onto the filthy dirt floor. Arthur physically recoiled, his stool scraping harshly and loudly against the concrete. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, terrified shade of gray. Thomas took a quick step back, his eyes darting wildly toward the closed door, as if calculating the quickest escape route. But Adrian's reaction was the absolute best. His jaw practically unhinged. The expensive smartphone slipped right from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the wooden table. What the hell is he doing here? Adrian stammered, his polished, arrogant corporate CEO persona completely shattering in a single instant. I stopped at the opposite end of the long table, resting my hands flat on the worn wood. "Hello, family," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, almost pleasant. "I hope I am not interrupting your busy, important schedules." Arthur finally found his voice, though it cracked pathetically. "Julian, we didn't expect you. You didn't answer our emails about the estate. You didn't come to the funeral." I smiled. Tight, incredibly dangerous smile. "It is remarkably hard to answer emails when you send them to the wrong address on purpose, Arthur. Just like it is incredibly hard to answer desperate phone calls when you give a dying man a fake number so he dies alone." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet below freezing. Thomas swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Beatrice looked wildly at Eleanor, sheer panic in her eyes. "Mother, you cannot possibly believe whatever insane lies he is spinning. He abandoned Walter. He didn't even care enough to show up to the funeral." Eleanor slammed her frail hand down on the table with unbelievable force. The sharp crack made everyone jump out of their skin. "Do not speak to me about lies, Beatrice," she roared, transforming instantly into a terrifying matriarch defending her blood. "I saw the notepad with my own 2 eyes. I personally verified the number with the phone company this morning. You manipulated an old, dying man on his deathbed just to secure your own disgusting greed. You are absolutely repulsive." Arthur stood up abruptly, his face flushing dark, angry red. "Now listen here, Mother. We did what was best for the family. Julian has always been an unpredictable wild card. He would have stressed Dad out with his failures. We were protecting the estate's assets." "Protecting the estate?" I fired back, my voice finally rising, vibrating with 30 years of repressed anger and hurt. "You were protecting your own wallets. You were terrified Grandpa would leave me a single dime that could have gone to your precious, failing golden boy over there." Adrian slammed his fist on the table. "Shut up, Julian. You don't know the first thing about business or the real world. This family needs massive capital to grow. You would just waste it playing with wires in a shed." "Enough!" Mr. Sterling's voice cut through the shouting like a sharp whip. "This is a formal legal proceeding, not a street brawl. Sit down. All of you, right now." The absolute authority in the lawyer's voice forced them into shocked submission. Arthur slowly sat back down, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Beatrice was visibly shaking, her manicured nails digging fiercely into her own arms. Adrian looked exactly like a cornered animal realizing the trap was springing shut. I remained standing. I was entirely in my element. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The workshop was dead silent, save for the dry, crisp rustling of heavy legal papers as Mr. Sterling methodically arranged his documents on the table. The air was so incredibly thick with tension you could practically choke on it. The dust continued to float in the sunbeams, totally indifferent to the absolute psychological carnage taking place around the table. I slowly pulled out a wooden stool and sat down directly opposite my brother. Adrian refused to look at me, keeping his eyes glued obsessively to the leather briefcase. His leg bounced nervously and uncontrollably under the table. His tech startup was bleeding money at an alarming rate. I knew this because I had done my homework. For the past 6 months, his company had been facing massive, crippling lawsuits over intellectual property theft, and his primary angel investors were threatening to pull out and leave him with millions in personal debt. He desperately needed the inheritance cash to cover his tracks and keep up the fragile facade of the successful, self-made CEO. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. We will proceed with the established, previously unsealed components of the will before addressing the sealed addendum. He read through the boilerplate legalities in a monotonous drone. The house, the surrounding acreage, and a substantial multimillion-dollar retirement account were placed in an irrevocable trust for Eleanor to ensure her care. No surprises there. Arthur and Beatrice received joint ownership of a highly lucrative commercial real estate property downtown, ensuring their lavish, country club lifestyle would continue entirely uninterrupted. They nodded slowly, looking slightly relieved. The sheer panic that had violently seized them when I first walked out of the shadows was starting to fade. In their arrogant minds, they had already won the war. I was just an annoying ghost who showed up to crash their victory party, but I had absolutely no legal power to change the outcome. And now, to the liquid assets, Sterling continued, his tone never changing. He pulled a crisp, heavily watermarked check from a secure folder. The sum of $10 million, derived from the highly profitable sale of Walter Whitman's early industrial patents in the 1990s, is to be awarded immediately to Adrian Whitman. A collective, massive exhale of relief left my parents' lips. Beatrice actually clapped her hands together in delight, a sickly sweet, triumphant smile returning to her heavily powdered face. Oh, thank God. Adrian, honey, this is exactly what you need to scale the business and crush the competition. Adrian reached out and snatched the check. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump. He stared down at the massive string of numbers, and a look of pure, arrogant, untouchable relief washed over his face. He tucked the check carefully into his designer jacket pocket, patting it once. He leaned back in his stool, his toxic confidence entirely restored. He looked across the table directly at me, a cruel, mocking sneer playing on his thin lips. "See, Julian?" Adrian said, his voice dripping with intense condescension and malice. Grandpa knew exactly who the real businessman in the family was. $10 million. That is real capital. That is real power. You can keep playing in the dirt out here in the middle of nowhere. I have an actual empire to build. Arthur chuckled darkly, shaking his head as he looked at me. You tried to cause a scene, Julian, but the law is the law. Dad knew you weren't capable of managing real wealth. It's time you face reality once and for all. Go earn your own. Maybe Adrian will hire you to sweep the floors at his new headquarters if you ask nicely. I looked at them. I really, truly looked at them. They were so utterly pathetic, so entirely consumed by the grand illusion of their own superiority, that they could not see the massive legal guillotine hovering right above their necks. I did not say a word. I did not react to the insult. I did not raise my voice. I just kept my eyes locked intently on Mr. Sterling. Sterling did not smile. He did not acknowledge their grotesque celebration. He slowly, deliberately closed the folder containing the check stub. He set it aside. The sound of the heavy folder hitting the wood was remarkably loud and final. Then he reached deep into the briefcase one last time. He pulled out the yellowed, worn envelope. The seal was completely intact, stamped heavily with red wax bearing the Whitman family crest. This was the envelope, the exact same envelope he would pull out again 3 days later in his pristine corporate office when we finalized the paperwork. But this right now, this was the moment of the actual devastating reveal. This was the absolute ground zero of the explosion. My parents' laughter died instantly in their throats. Adrian's hand froze awkwardly over his jacket pocket. As I stated earlier, Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a grave, incredibly solemn tone that commanded total silence. The distribution of the $10 million was entirely contingent upon the reading of this final addendum. Walter explicitly requested that this document be kept entirely secret from his legal team until the very moment of its execution. I myself do not know what is written inside, but it is legally binding, properly notarized by an independent magistrate, and it completely supersedes all prior distributions of intellectual property. Beatrice swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously. Intellectual property? But the commercial real estate and the cash cover everything of value, don't they? Thomas, the snake in the grass who had been silent, leaned forward abruptly. His eyes were wide with sudden, blinding panic. Wait, Walter's current IP, the Whitman Innovations portfolio. Where is that allocated? That wasn't in the primary trust documents. Sterling picked up a sleek silver letter opener. He slid it slowly under the flap of the old envelope. The loud tearing of the thick paper sounded exactly like a scream in the quiet room. Adrian's face went chalk white. Whitman Innovations? No, that cannot be separate. That is the core patent for the data compression algorithm. My company is actively integrating that algorithm into our software right now. We are launching it next month. If I do not officially own the IP, the lawsuits will absolutely bury me. Sterling unfolded the thick, handwritten pages. He smoothed them out flat on the table. He took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to read the words that would change the trajectory of my entire life and completely destroy theirs. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands, and gave my brother a very small, very cold smile. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. Mr. Sterling smoothed the thick, handwritten pages flat against the scarred wood of the heavy workbench. The silence in the workshop was absolute, unbroken except for the ragged, shallow breathing of my brother, Adrian. Every single eye in the room was locked onto those aged pieces of paper. This was the moment the earth shifted on its axis. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, his professional demeanor entirely unbothered by the sheer panic radiating from my family. He began to read, his deep voice carrying into the rafters of the old barn. To my grandson Julian Whitman, Sterling read, the words hitting the air like physical weights. The collective intake of breath from my parents was loud enough to be comical under different circumstances. My mother's hand gripped my father's arm so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Adrian's eyes darted frantically between the lawyer and the documents, his face a mask of total disbelief. Sterling continued, completely ignoring them. I leave the entirety of the Whitman Research Annex, including the physical structure, the surrounding acreage of the workshop, all laboratory equipment, all existing raw materials, and the dedicated funding accounts associated with its maintenance. Furthermore, and most importantly, I leave the sole, uncontested ownership of all active research patents, historical data logs, and the complete intellectual property portfolio currently filed under Whitman Innovations. A sound escaped Adrian's throat. It was not a word. It was a choked, guttural noise, like a man who had just been punched squarely in the stomach. He shot up from his stool, the piece of furniture crashing violently to the concrete floor behind him. What? Adrian spat, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual corporate polish. No. Read that again. You read that wrong, Sterling. He cannot give him the IP. That is impossible. Mr. Sterling looked up over his wire-rimmed glasses, his expression utterly freezing. I do not misread legal documents, Mr. Whitman. The language here is incredibly specific, heavily vetted, and legally ironclad. Julian is the sole inheritor of the Whitman Innovations portfolio. Every algorithm, every blueprint, every patent your grandfather ever filed. It belongs to Julian. That is insane, Adrian screamed, his hands tearing at his perfectly styled hair. He pointed a trembling finger at my parents. You told me. You literally sat in my condo and promised me that if I just kept visiting him, if I played the good, dutiful grandson, the estate would roll the IP into my trust. You said it would all be mine. My father's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. He looked like he was going to be sick. My mother stared at the dirt floor as if she was praying it would magically open up and swallow her whole. They had made promises they had no right to make, writing checks with another man's legacy. I just sat there on my stool, perfectly still, perfectly calm, watching their meticulously crafted house of cards collapse in real time. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Do you have any idea what this means? Adrian yelled, pacing frantically back and forth, his expensive leather shoes kicking up clouds of dust. He turned his wild eyes to my father. Dad, the data compression algorithm. The core code that Apex Solutions is built on. I based my entire platform on Grandpa's old server logs. I assumed I would inherit the patent before the software went public. If Julian owns the patent, I do not own my own product. There it was. The ugly, unvarnished truth spilled out into the open air. Adrian had not built a groundbreaking tech company from scratch. He had not innovated a single thing. He had simply gone through my grandfather's old, discarded files from the late 90s, found a highly advanced algorithm my grandfather had developed but never commercialized, and stolen it. He built his entire startup on stolen intellectual property, banking entirely on the assumption that he would inherit the legal rights before anyone noticed. My father stood up, trying to project authority, but his voice was shaking. Julian, listen to me. Be reasonable for 1 second in your life. You do not understand the corporate tech world. You do not know how to monetize an algorithm. That IP is useless to you sitting in this dusty shed. Adrian has the infrastructure. He has angel investors. He has a massive payroll. Sign the IP transfer papers today. We will give you a cut. A generous cut. We will give you $1 million from Adrian's check. I looked at Arthur. I let the silence stretch out, letting him stew in his own desperation. $1 million, I repeated slowly, letting the insult hang in the air. You want to buy a patent portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars, a portfolio that is the literal beating heart of your Golden Boys company, for a fraction of what Grandpa just handed him in cash? Beatrice stepped forward, tears of pure manipulation welling in her eyes. Julian, please. You are brothers. This is family. If you keep this IP, Adrian's investors will find out he doesn't own his core product. The tech conglomerate he is competing against is already threatening a lawsuit. They will crush him. He will go to federal prison for fraud. Julian, you cannot do this to your own brother. I am not doing anything to him, Mother, I said, my voice eerily calm. I did not force him to build a company on stolen blueprints. I did not force him to lie to his investors. And I certainly did not force him to give his dying grandfather a fake phone number, so he wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of saying goodbye. Thomas, my uncle, finally spoke up, trying to use his slick PR voice to de-escalate the situation. Now, Julian, let's not let emotions cloud our business judgment. There is a mutually beneficial solution here. We can structure a licensing deal. You retain nominal ownership, but Adrian gets exclusive perpetual rights. Keeps the family out of the courts. It is the smart play. I turned my gaze to Thomas. There is no deal, Thomas. There is no licensing agreement. There is no negotiation. Grandpa knew exactly what Adrian was doing. He knew Adrian was snooping through his servers. He knew Adrian was stealing his life's work. And he knew that the $10 million in cash would not be nearly enough to save Adrian from the massive legal fees when the real creators of the tech came collecting. Grandpa gave Adrian the cash to hang himself with, and he gave me the rope. Adrian stopped pacing. He looked at the $10 million check sticking out of his jacket pocket. Suddenly, it was not a ticket to endless wealth. It was an anchor. Without the IP, his company was worthless. The investors would sue him personally for gross negligence and fraud. The $10 million would be instantly seized in litigation, and he would still owe millions more. He was entirely, fundamentally ruined. You planned this? Adrian hissed, taking a step toward me. His hands balled into tight fists. You manipulated him. You poisoned him against me. You are just a jealous, pathetic loser who couldn't stand seeing me succeed. I stood up. I didn't rush. I just rose from my stool, standing to my full height. I was taller than Adrian, and for the first time in my life, I did not shrink to make him feel comfortable. I did not have to say a single word to him, Adrian, I said quietly, looking down at him. Grandpa was a lot of things, but he was not blind. He saw you. He saw all of you. He saw that you treated love like a transaction. You smiled when you were told to. You said the right things because you thought it would pay off in the end. But love is not a performance, and neither is respect. Adrian lunged forward. He actually tried to grab me by the collar of my suit. But before he could even close the distance, a voice cracked through the workshop like thunder. "Sit back down, Adrian, or so help me God. I will have Sterling write you out of the estate completely under the morality clause." It was Eleanor. My grandmother stood at the head of the table, her eyes practically shooting fire. She had remained silent during the initial reading, observing the absolute meltdown of her son and grandson. Now she was done watching. Adrian froze. He looked at Eleanor, then back at me, his chest heaving. Slowly, humiliatingly, he picked up his stool and sat back down, burying his face in his hands. Mr. Sterling, who had watched the entire exchange with the detached fascination of a scientist observing rats in a maze, calmly cleared his throat again. "If the outbursts are quite finished," Sterling said smoothly, tapping a heavy pen against his legal pad, "we are not done. There is more." Walter Whitman also included a personal letter directed to Julian, which he legally mandated must be read aloud in this room, in front of this specific assembly of individuals. Adrian let out a bitter, wet laugh, but no one joined him. My mother stared at the floor. My father looked out the dirty window, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Eleanor nodded firmly at the lawyer. "Read it, Mr. Sterling. Read every single word. My husband made me promise." Sterling unfolded the final piece of paper. It was not typed legalese. It was Grandpa's broad, confident, cursive handwriting. It filled the entire page. As Sterling began to read, the harsh reality of the workshop seemed to fade away, replaced by the warm, steady presence of the man who had always believed in me. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. "To my dearest grandson Julian," Mr. Sterling began, his professional cadence softening just a fraction to honor the deeply personal words of his old client. "If this letter is being read aloud, then I am no longer sitting by your side at the workbench. But my belief in you remains, stronger and more absolute than it has ever been. I need you to hear these words, and I need the people sitting in that room with you to hear them as well." The words hit my chest like a warm, powerful wind rushing through an open window. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the sound of my grandfather's intended voice wash over me. "You were always the quiet one," Sterling continued reading. "You were the observer, the thinker, the one who constantly asked, why, when the rest of your family didn't care enough to look past the surface. You built your own genuine truth in a family that never, not for one single day, learned to honor yours." I heard a sharp, ragged exhale from across the table. It was my mother. Her fingers were twisting nervously in her lap, her designer rings catching the dim light. She was finally hearing the judgment she had avoided her entire life. "I saw everything, Julian. I saw how you clutched that little blue notebook when you were 7 years old, meticulously tracking how long it took raindrops to fill a glass. I saw how your brilliant face lit up when you discovered mechanical patterns, while your parents only saw annoying distractions. I saw the way your joy completely dimmed when your mother brushed you off to go brag about your brother. I saw the way your father aggressively changed the subject every single time you shared something you were fiercely proud of." My chest tightened painfully. I remembered that little blue notebook. I still had it packed away in a box in my apartment. I remembered the exact feeling of shrinking into myself, of learning to make myself as small and invisible as possible so I wouldn't invite their ridicule. Sterling's voice remained remarkably steady, even as the incredible weight of the words completely shifted the air pressure in the room. "Adrian was simply easier for them," the letter went on. "He sparkled in all the loud, superficial ways they understood. He played the corporate game. But you, Julian, you glowed in profound ways they could not translate. And instead of taking the time to learn your language, instead of trying to understand the brilliant mind of their own son, they shut you out. They labeled you a failure because you refused to run in their mindless rat race." Adrian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his face completely hidden. I remember the day you won your first major science fair in high school. Sterling read. I remember you walking into this very workshop and asking me to hide the trophy for you. You looked at me with tears in your eyes and said, maybe if I don't show it to them, they'll stop looking at me like I'm someone else's defective child. It broke my heart, Julian. You deserved grand celebrations. You deserved standing ovations, not forced invisibility. A low, incredibly painful sob escaped from someone in the room. It was Eleanor. She was weeping silently, her hands covering her mouth, realizing the absolute depth of the emotional abuse that had happened right under her nose for decades. While I cannot go back in time and undo the immense psychological damage they inflicted upon you, the letter concluded, I can give you something that is entirely, legally, and permanently yours. I give you this annex. I give you the intellectual property. I give you a physical place to build freely, to invent without apology, and to exist entirely without their toxic shadows. Write the things they do not understand, Julian. One day the world will. With all my love and endless respect, Grandpa Walter. Mr. Sterling paused, folding the thick letter slowly and carefully along its original creases. He slipped it back into the envelope and pushed it across the table toward me. I reached out and rested my hand flat over the paper. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavily loaded with decades of memory, intense resentment, and finally, absolute clarity. Cleared my throat. I looked directly at Arthur and Beatrice. I remember that science fair, I said softly, my voice breaking the heavy tension. Mom didn't come because she was picking up Adrian's tailored suit for a fraternity formal. Dad didn't come because he was playing 18 holes with a prospective client. I came home holding that heavy gold trophy like it was some kind of unforgivable sin. My father finally looked up. His face was a mixture of guilt and defensive anger. Julian, please. This is highly inappropriate. This isn't the time or the place to rehash ancient history or perceived childhood slights. No, I said, my voice suddenly sharpening into a blade. It is the exact time, because all I ever got from either of you, my entire life, was, why can't you just be more like your brother? You demanded that I conform to a mold that was fundamentally broken to begin with. I turned my head to look at Adrian. And from you? Every single time I tried to be proud of something I built, every time I achieved a milestone, you turned it into a threat. You mocked my engineering degrees. You called my research useless. And then, when you realized you were creatively bankrupt, you logged into Grandpa's servers and stole the very work you claimed was garbage. Adrian scoffed loudly, slamming his hand on the table. Oh, come on. You always made yourself the eternal victim. I worked for what I got. I built a brand. You built a lie. I snapped, my voice echoing off the tin roof. You visited Grandpa when it was financially convenient. You smiled when you were explicitly told to. You said the right things because you calculated it would pay off in a massive inheritance. And when he got sick, when he actually needed his family, what did you do? Adrian's expression hardened into pure malice. And what? You think you're so morally pure? You disappeared for over a year. You abandoned him when he was dying. I was cut off. I roared, the anger finally bursting out of me. I pointed a shaking finger at Thomas, then at Arthur. You told Grandma I didn't want to see her. You gave Grandpa a completely fake cell phone number and made absolutely sure I never received his desperate messages. You intercepted the emails. You lied about the time of the funeral. That is not distance, Adrian. That is erasure. You tried to erase my existence. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly. Enough, Julian. Stop this. You are twisting everything. This family has been through a massive trauma. This family, Eleanor cut in, her voice cold and sharp as a scythe, has been living a disgusting lie, and I am deeply ashamed that I let it happen in my home for far too long. Beatrice turned to her, genuinely stunned. Mother, please don't do this. We were protecting. Do not call me mother, Eleanor spat. I watched you all turn a completely blind eye to Julian's obvious pain for 30 years. I foolishly believed you when you looked me in the eye and said he didn't care about us. I should have known better. I should have known that a boy who spent every weekend in this workshop would never abandon his grandfather. Arthur shifted incredibly uncomfortably in his seat. Look, Mom. Julian got his advanced education. He got his lab camps. He got his travel. That wasn't free. We provided for him. No, I said, looking at my father with utter pity. It wasn't free, but you didn't pay for a single cent of it. Grandpa did. Every single scholarship application he quietly filled out for me, the late-night flights, the expensive engineering journals. You didn't even know where I went to college half the time. You made me feel like an unbearable burden. He made me feel seen. I looked at Adrian, who was staring blankly at the wall, completely defeated. You were the performer, Adrian, the chosen golden child. I was the hidden one. But Grandpa didn't forget me, and now you do not get to erase me anymore. I own the ground you are standing on. I own the code your company relies on. You have absolutely nothing. Eleanor stood up. She walked slowly to the very center of the room, her posture unshaken, radiating absolute authority. She looked directly at Arthur, Beatrice, Adrian, and Thomas. I deeply regret that Walter left you $10 million, she said, looking at Adrian. You may have played the role perfectly, but it was never love. It was a cold, calculated transaction. And I am thoroughly ashamed I didn't see through your act sooner. She pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy double doors of the barn. Leave, all of you. You are no longer welcome on this property. You are no longer welcome in my home. And as far as I am concerned, I no longer have a son. My mother gasped dramatically, clutching her pearls. Eleanor, you cannot mean that. Out, Eleanor commanded, her voice echoing with finality. Now. They didn't move at first. The sheer shock of the absolute rejection paralyzed them. Then, Adrian grabbed his phone, shoved the useless $10 million check deeper into his pocket, and stormed out, his expensive shoes hitting the dirt like gunshots. My parents and Thomas followed immediately behind him, stunned, muttering panicked things about legal challenges and hiring defense attorneys. For the very first time in my entire life, they couldn't take anything of value with them. The heavy barn doors clicked shut behind them. There was no dramatic slamming, just profound, absolute finality. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. It has been exactly 3 years since that explosive will reading. 3 years since the heavy barn doors closed behind my parents and my brother, their panicked footsteps echoing down the gravel driveway like the pathetic end of a theatrical performance that absolutely no one clapped for. A lot can change in 3 years when you are finally allowed to breathe without asking for permission. I took ownership of the Whitman Research Annex and immediately got to work. I quit my corporate engineering job the very next morning. I reached out to Marcus, a brilliant structural engineer and my closest friend from university. Together, we ripped the old barn apart and built it back up. What started as one dusty, converted shed has now miraculously grown into a full-scale, state-of-the-art research campus. We have 4 primary laboratories, 3 massive climate-controlled greenhouses, and over 60 acres of active trial fields. We officially launched Whitman Labs. We specialized in exactly what Grandpa had started: advanced agricultural tech and sustainable microirrigation systems. But success always attracts vultures. You think you rid yourself of the snakes when you cut off your toxic family, but the world is full of people looking for a shortcut. About 18 months into our massive expansion, we brought on a third partner, a guy named Greg. Greg was a slick venture capitalist who promised to help us secure federal grants. He was charming, he wore the right suits, and he spoke the language of money perfectly. For a while, he was a massive asset. But then, I noticed discrepancies in our patent filings. Greg, blinded by sheer greed, had secretly initiated back-channel negotiations with a massive rival tech conglomerate, the exact same conglomerate that had sued my brother into oblivion. Greg was attempting to orchestrate a hostile buyout, planning to sell our core intellectual property right out from under me through a buried loophole in our operating agreement. He thought I was just a naive scientist who wouldn't read the fine print. He was half right. I am a scientist, but my grandmother, Eleanor, is a force of nature. Since the fallout with my parents, Eleanor had moved into a beautifully renovated suite attached to my new house on the property. She spent her mornings drinking tea and reading our corporate contracts just for fun. She had spent 40 years married to a genius inventor. She knew exactly how corporate vultures operated. It was Eleanor who caught the buried clause. It was Eleanor who sat at the conference table, looked Greg dead in his eyes, and slid a massive dossier of his illegal communications across the wood. She didn't yell. She just smiled a terrifying, polite Southern smile and told him that if he wasn't off the property in 10 minutes, she was calling the FBI for corporate espionage. Greg practically tripped over his own feet running to his car. We completely bought out his worthless shares for pennies on the dollar. It was a beautiful victory, and it solidified the fact that the only family I actually needed was the woman drinking tea across from me. But the universe has a very funny, very dark sense of humor. One humid Tuesday afternoon, I was walking back from the greenhouses, wiping dirt off my jeans, when I saw a car pull up to the main gate of the lab. It was a Porsche Cayenne, but it wasn't sleek and shiny anymore. The front bumper was cracked, the paint was heavily scratched, and it sounded like the transmission was dying a loud, painful death. The door creaked open and Adrian stepped out. I stopped in my tracks. I had not seen or spoken to my brother in 3 years. I barely recognized the man standing in front of me. Gone were the tailored Italian suits and the expensive, perfectly coiffed hair. He was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt that looked like he had slept in it for a week. He was painfully thin, his face gaunt, and he had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. He looked exactly like a man who had been thoroughly chewed up and spit out by the real world. I walked slowly up to the chain-link fence. I didn't open the gate. I just stood on my side, waiting. Adrian looked up at the massive, gleaming glass facade of Whitman Labs. He looked at the rows of employee cars. Then he looked at me. His arrogant pride was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate exhaustion. "Julian," he said, his voice raspy and weak. "Adrian," I replied, my tone perfectly neutral. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He swallowed hard, looking down at his scuffed shoes. "Apex Solutions is gone. The conglomerate sued me for everything. They proved the core algorithm was completely identical to Grandpa's old patents. The judge froze my assets. The $10 million from the inheritance went entirely to legal fees and settling the fraud charges so I wouldn't go to federal prison. I am completely bankrupt, Julian. The bank is foreclosing on my condo on Friday. My wife left me. I have nothing." I just stared at him. I didn't feel a sudden rush of vindictive triumph. I didn't feel the urge to laugh in his face. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. He had been handed the entire world on a silver platter, completely funded by my parents' blind favoritism, and he had burned it all to the ground because he thought he was smarter than everyone else. "Why are you telling me this, Adrian?" I asked. He gripped the chain-link fence, his knuckles white. "Because the judge mandated that I secure verifiable employment by the end of the month as part of my probation for the corporate fraud settlement. No one in the tech sector will even look at my resume. I am blacklisted. Dad and Mom's commercial properties tanked in the recession, and they moved to Florida. They won't give me a dime. They said I embarrassed the family name." The irony was absolutely thick enough to cut with a knife. The golden child, the perfect investment, had finally become a liability, and my parents had discarded him exactly like they had discarded me. "I need a job, Julian," Adrian whispered, tears finally pooling in his eyes. "I will do anything. I will sweep the floors. I will clean the bathrooms. Please, I am begging you." I looked at the man who had tormented me for 30 years. The man who had mocked my dreams, stolen my grandfather's work, and tried to leave me with absolutely nothing. I held his entire pathetic future in the palm of my hand. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. I stood at the fence for a long, agonizing minute, watching my brother tremble in the afternoon heat. Part of me, the angry, deeply wounded teenager who used to hide his trophies in the closet, wanted to laugh in his face, spit on the ground, and walk away. It would have been incredibly easy. It would have been justified. But as I looked at him, I realized something fundamental. If I acted out of pure vengeance, if I used my power to completely crush him while he was already crawling on the ground, I would be operating on the exact same toxic wavelength that my parents did. I would be perpetuating the Whitman family curse. I had spent 3 years building a sanctuary of healing and innovation. I was not going to let his desperation poison my soil. I am not giving you a dime of cash, Adrian, I said, my voice firm and unwavering. And you are absolutely never stepping foot inside the main research facility. You will never have access to a computer, a server, or a piece of proprietary data on this campus. Are we clear? Adrian nodded frantically, wiping his eyes with the back of his dirty sleeve. Yes, whatever you say. I just need a verifiable paycheck for the probation officer. We recently launched a community outreach program, I continued. The Little Scientist Initiative. We teach underprivileged kids basic agriculture and engineering. It requires a lot of manual labor. Digging irrigation trenches, hauling bags of compost, repairing raised garden beds in the brutal sun. Pays minimum wage. The hours are long, and the work is exhausting. You report to Marcus, not me. If you complain once, if you show up late once, you are immediately fired. Take it or leave it. Adrian looked at his ruined luxury car, then back at me. He let out a long, shaky breath, completely surrendering. I'll take it. Thank you, Julian. Thank you. I didn't say you're welcome. I just unlatched the gate, pointed him toward the maintenance shed, and walked back to my lab. We are not brothers in the way other people mean it. We don't grab beers on the weekend. We don't talk about our childhoods. But every morning at 6 a.m., I look out the window of my office and see the former CEO of Apex Solutions hauling 50-pound bags of manure in the blazing sun. He keeps his head down. He works hard. And slowly, painfully, he is learning the actual value of $1. As for my parents, Arthur and Beatrice are living in a small, incredibly boring retirement community in Central Florida. Their massive commercial real estate investments went belly up shortly after the will reading. Without Adrian's fake success to brag about, their social circle completely abandoned them. Sometimes their names pop up in my email inbox. The subject lines are usually pathetic attempts at reconciliation. Thinking of you, or family is forever. I never open them. I select them, hit delete, and empty the trash folder. I don't hate them anymore. Hate requires energy, and I refuse to spend another ounce of my precious energy on people who only love conditionally. I have finally established absolute, impenetrable boundaries. They are not allowed in my world. My world is filled with things that actually matter. Later that same afternoon, I walked down to the community garden plots. A 12-year-old boy named Leo was sitting in the dirt, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. He was a shy, incredibly quiet kid from a rough neighborhood who barely spoke above a whisper. He was holding a small, battery-powered water pump, trying to figure out why the pressure wasn't reaching the end of the PVC pipe. I knelt down in the dirt next to him. Having trouble with the flow rate, Leo? I asked gently. He jumped slightly, then looked down at his dirty hands. It's stupid. I can't get it to work. I'm just not smart enough for this stuff. My heart ached. I knew that exact feeling. I knew the heavy weight of that specific lie. I reached over and gently tapped the side of the pump housing. You are incredibly smart, Leo. The pump isn't broken, and neither are you. You just have a small airlock in the intake valve. Look here. If you bleed the air out of this tiny nozzle first, the water has a clear path to follow. I handed him a small wrench. He carefully loosened the valve. A hiss of trapped air escaped, followed immediately by a strong, steady stream of water shooting out the end of the pipe, perfectly watering the row of young tomato plants. Leo's eyes went wide. A massive, brilliant smile broke across his face. "It works. I did it." "Yes, you did," I smiled, patting him on the shoulder. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't figure something out. You just have to look at the problem differently." I stood up and watched him excitedly tinker with the water flow. I reached into the breast pocket of my lab coat and pulled out Grandpa Walter's old silver pocket watch. I flicked the lid open. Inside, tucked safely behind the glass, was a tiny, faded photograph of me at 10 years old, standing proudly next to my first science fair project, grinning from ear to ear. Grandpa never let me disappear. He built a safe harbor for me, and he left me the map to find it. Legacy isn't a monument made of stone, and it certainly isn't a $10 million check. Legacy is a map built from choices, kindness, and tiny anchors left behind for someone to follow when the rest of the world desperately tries to erase them. My name is Julian Whitman. I am 32 years old. My family tried to destroy me, but instead, they accidentally handed me the tools to build an empire. I finally wrote my own role, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to cut ties with the people who were supposed to love you the most in order to finally protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Remember, you are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next video.